The day started like any other when I set out on my hike. I had been itching to get away from the bustle of city life for a while, and after a few weeks of planning, I finally decided to take a solo hiking trip in the mountains. The trail I chose was one I'd heard about through word of mouth, a remote, less traveled path up a mountain in the Rockies, offering breathtaking views and solitude. It was exactly what I needed. I woke up early, packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, water, and a first aid kit, and hit the road just as the sun began to rise. The drive itself was about 2 hours long, but the landscape changed quickly as I got further from the city. The wide, open fields turned into dense forests, and the trees grew taller as I approached the trailhead. I parked my car in a small gravel lot, surrounded by nothing but towering pines and the distant mountain peaks, still capped with snow even though it was late spring. It was just me, the wilderness, and my thoughts. The trailhead was marked with a simple wooden sign, but there was no one around. I was completely alone. I smiled at the thought of how peaceful it would be. The first part of the trail was smooth and easy to follow. The ground was firm, the path well-worn, and the air was fresh. Birds chirped above, and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't the only one out here. For the first couple of hours, I felt calm and happy, the type of serenity only nature can provide. But that peace didn't last long. The further I hiked, the more the trail seemed to narrow. The trees grew thicker, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in patches, leaving most of the path shrouded in shadow. The air was cooler now, and the underbrush more overgrown. I had to push aside branches and step carefully around rocks and fallen logs. At some point, the sound of birds began to fade. The forest grew eerily quiet. It wasn't the silence of a normal, peaceful wilderness. It was a tense kind of quiet, like everything was holding its breath, waiting. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. I kept walking, telling myself that it was just my nerves, that it was probably nothing, but the feeling only grew stronger as I went further. My mind kept racing with little irrational thoughts. The trees, the shadows, the quiet. Something about this place didn't sit right with me. After another hour or so of hiking, I came to a clearing. It was wide open and flat, surrounded by tall pines. In the center of the clearing was a strange sight, an old, decaying structure. It looked like the remnants of a small cabin, though it had been long abandoned. The wood was weathered and rotting, the windows long shattered. It was out of place in the middle of the wilderness, far from any road or trail that I could see. I felt a momentary hesitation, but my curiosity got the better of me. I approached the cabin, keeping a cautious distance. There was a thick layer of dirt and moss covering the ground around it. The air around the cabin felt different, colder. I didn't know why, but I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach as I reached the door. It was ajar, but I didn't want to go inside. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but the cabin just gave off this eerie vibe. I took a few steps closer, inspecting the outside. The wood was scarred with deep, rough marks, like something had scratched at it. It wasn't just weather damage. The longer I looked, the more it seemed like something had been clawing at the cabin, trying to get inside. The strange part was that there were no signs of human activity. No footprints, no garbage, no broken bottles or signs of other hikers having passed through here recently. In fact, there were no signs of anything at all, except for the faint scratch marks on the cabin's walls. I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. I took one last look at the cabin, feeling an uncomfortable prickle at the back of my neck. Then I turned around and started walking back along the trail, telling myself I was overthinking things. The moment I turned my back to the cabin, however, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, but the air felt heavier, thicker. I glanced back over my shoulder, just a quick glance, and I saw something moving in the woods behind me. It was fast, too fast for a deer or any animal I recognized. It darted between the trees, but I only saw a shadow, nothing distinct enough to make out. My heart skipped a beat, quickened my pace. The silence was back, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. Every step felt like it echoed too loudly. Every breath felt too loud. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something following me. But I never did. The forest remained still, unnaturally still. The rest of the hike was a blur of anxiety and unease. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong, but no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't. The quiet was maddening. The trees felt like they were closing in on me. The trail, once so open and clear, now seemed to twist and wind in unfamiliar ways. I felt lost, even though I was sure I was still on the main trail. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the light started to fade. I realized I had been walking for hours, with no sign of the trailhead or any sign of civilization. I should have turned around hours ago, but now it was too late to go back in the dark. My stomach churned with unease as I tried to decide what to do. There was no sign of anyone else, and the trail seemed to keep stretching further into the forest, with no end in sight. My water was running low, and I hadn't eaten anything since lunch. My best bet, I figured, was to find a good place to camp for the night. I wasn't exactly prepared for an overnight hike, but I had a tent and a sleeping bag so I could survive until morning. I found a small clearing with a few flat patches of ground, enough to set up camp. The air was colder now, and the shadows were growing deeper around me. I hurried to get my tent set up, my hands shaking from a mixture of exhaustion and anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and no matter how many times I told myself it was just the stress of being alone in the wilderness, the feeling didn't go away. By the time the tent was up, the sun was almost completely gone, and the forest had become an impenetrable mass of shadows. The temperature had dropped quickly, and the wind had picked up. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot kept me on edge. It felt like the forest was alive, like it was reacting to my presence. I crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and huddled in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing heart. I kept the flashlight on. I didn't even want to go on that hike in the first place. It was one of those things I decided to do because I was sick of the routine I had fallen into. Wake up, stare at a screen all day, eat the same bland meals, lie in bed for hours without really sleeping. Something about getting out into the woods felt like it might break that pattern. Maybe some peace and quiet. Maybe I'd remember how to just breathe again. So I picked a trail I found online, packed up my gear, and drove 3 hours out to the middle of nowhere. It was early fall, the kind of weather where the mornings bite your fingertips but the afternoons make you sweat. The trailhead was empty when I got there, and for most of that first day, I didn't see another soul. Just trees in every direction and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I had a paper map and a compass, and I'd marked the path I planned to follow. I wasn't trying to prove anything, just looking for a few days of quiet. I had 4 days worth of food, a small tent, and enough water purification tablets to last the trip. The first night was uneventful. I pitched my tent near a creek, cooked some freeze-dried rice and beans, and listened to the wind rustling the branches overhead. There were some weird little noises out there. Twigs snapping, dry leaves shifting, but nothing unusual. It's the woods. Stuff moves around. Animals scurry. I told myself not to overthink it. I slept okay. The second day, I hiked about 10 miles deeper into the woods, veering off the more popular trails and following a side path that looped around a small ridge. I passed a few old campsites, but none looked like they had been used in a long time. Just stone fire rings and the occasional beer can someone had left behind. I found a decent flat spot around dusk and set up camp again. Same routine: boil water, eat some food, hang the bear bag high in a tree, crawl into the tent. That night is when things got weird. It started with noises, not just the usual nighttime forest sounds. This was different. Something kept circling the area around my tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a raccoon nosing around, but it didn't move like that. It wasn't random. It made slow, deliberate passes around me, crunching leaves, then a long pause, then more crunching, then nothing, then again on the other side. I lay there, heart thumping, trying to slow my breathing. Every sound felt amplified inside the tent. I couldn't see a thing out there. I reached quietly for my flashlight, turned it on, and shined it through the mesh of the tent. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Eventually, it stopped, where I fell asleep. I don't remember. I just know I woke up later because of the most ridiculous thing. I farted. Not just a little one either. It was loud enough that I startled awake, mid-blast. I literally woke up while still farting. It echoed inside the tent like a trumpet solo in a closet. For a second, I just blinked, disoriented, wondering what the hell had happened. Then the smell hit me, and I almost gagged. It was horrendous. That damn rice and beans. I'd eaten it 2 nights in a row. Big mistake. I sat up, unzipped part of the tent to get some air in, and tried to laugh it off. It was stupid, but then I heard it again. Crunch. Closer this time. Something had come back, or maybe it had never really left. I held still, listened. It moved around again, that same deliberate pace. Slow steps, long pauses. I kept the flashlight off. Maybe it was better not to draw attention. I figured if it was a bear, it would have gone after the bear bag. But it hadn't. It was circling me. I didn't sleep much after that. I must have drifted off eventually, but the next thing I knew, it was light again. Morning. My back ached. My head felt foggy. I stepped outside and checked around the tent. There weren't any clear tracks, but the leaves looked disturbed in a wide ring around my camp, like something had walked around and around in the dark. I packed up quickly that morning. I didn't eat. I just wanted to keep moving. Something about that night shook me more than I wanted to admit. I told myself it had to be an animal. Nothing else made sense. That third day, I didn't follow the trail I'd planned. I just started moving in the general direction of the car. I didn't want to stay another night. I figured I could hike the whole day, maybe find a signal somewhere high up and get a GPS lock. Around midday, I stopped for a break at a small clearing. There were fallen logs and a patch of sun. I sat down, ate a protein bar, drank some water. That's when I noticed a smell. Not mine this time, something else. It smelled like old meat. Wet dog. Rot. I got up, looked around. Nothing in sight. But the smell was there. Faint but steady. I started moving again, and the noises came back. Not close, not yet. But they were out there. Leaves rustling when there was no wind. Branches cracking. And always just when I was starting to calm down. That night, I found a flat spot next to a rock outcropping and camped as high up as I could. I hoped elevation might help me see or hear better, maybe even catch a bar of service. But nothing, just the same dead zone. I didn't even bother cooking. I ate a dry protein bar and drank water. I didn't take off my boots. I just lay there, in the tent, gripping my knife. The footsteps came again, slower this time, and they didn't circle. They stopped just outside the tent. Just stopped. No breathing, no sniffing, no scratching, just waiting. I lay there for what felt like hours. My muscles cramped. I didn't move. I didn't blink. It never left. It never came closer either. Eventually, I must have blacked out. Exhaustion, maybe. When I opened my eyes, it was light again. But the ground outside the tent had deep impressions. Not boots. Not hooves, something else, like someone had stood barefoot on the forest floor for hours. I didn't pack neatly that day. I just crammed everything into the bag and started moving. I cut straight through brush and saplings, following the sun, checking the compass every few minutes. I was done. I wanted out. It followed me, not always close, but I knew it was there. I'd stop to catch my breath and hear the twigs snap behind me. I changed direction, then hear it again, a little while later. I never saw it. Late that afternoon, I found a trail marker, an old wooden post with a faded blaze painted on it. I almost cried. I followed it fast, feet blistered, knees shaking, just kept going. At some point, I stopped hearing the noises, just my own boots, just the wind. By the time I reached my car, the sun was low. I threw my pack in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. When I got home, I showered 3 times. I threw out the leftover food. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I remembered that moment I woke myself up farting. and how something had been standing just outside my tent, listening. I haven't gone camping since. I still hike sometimes, but only on short, popular trails. I don't stray far. I don't stay overnight. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear a sound outside my window or a creak in the floor, I wonder if whatever was out there remembers me too. Not because I saw it, but because of the sound I made. Loud enough to wake me up. Loud enough, maybe, to wake it up too. I've never really been the type to get spooked easily. I grew up camping in the woods with my dad, hiking trails that snaked through the hills behind our old house, and sleeping in tents while the sounds of the forest moved around us at night. I always felt at home out there, more relaxed among the trees and dirt than I ever did in the city. That kind of comfort can be dangerous, though. You stop thinking that bad things can happen out there. You stop seeing the risks. You trust your surroundings too much. This story happened last fall, early October. The air had just started to cool down, and the leaves were changing. I had a 3-day weekend coming up and figured I'd take a solo hike out to a less traveled trail about 2 hours from where I lived. My husband had to work that weekend, so he stayed back. We didn't think much of it. I'd done solo hikes before. I packed light but smart my gear, food, water, a good first aid kit, and a signal mirror and whistle just in case. My phone was fully charged and loaded with offline maps. I had everything I needed, or so I thought. The trail I picked started off a quiet back road, and it wasn't well known. That was kind of the point. I didn't want crowded campsites or running into families every 10 minutes. I wanted the quiet. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near the trailhead and left a note on the dashboard with the date I planned to return. I texted my husband the coordinates just like always, and I headed off. The first day was great. I hiked about 8 miles in and found a nice flat spot off the trail to set up camp. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and ate dinner watching the sky turn from orange to purple. It was cold but manageable. I bundled up, climbed into my sleeping bag, and was out pretty quick. I remember lying there in the dark, listening to the wind move through the trees. The sound of nature was like a blanket. I felt safe. That night was when the first thing happened. It wasn't much, but I woke up a couple hours after falling asleep, sweating. I wasn't too cold or too hot, but I had this sharp awareness in my gut, like something had pulled me from sleep. I stayed still and listened. Nothing, just wind, the occasional rustle of a branch or leaves. I told myself it was a deer or maybe just my own dreams and went back to sleep. But I kept waking up. Not from noise, not from anything specific. Just that same feeling in my gut like something was off, like I was being watched. I sat up a couple times and looked outside the tent, shining my flashlight into the woods. Nothing. Eventually, sleep pulled me back. The next morning, everything seemed fine. I made coffee, packed up camp, and kept moving. The trail got more narrow and less distinct the deeper I went. I crossed an old logging road around mid-morning and saw no signs of recent use. That was the last sign of civilization I'd see for the next day. Around noon, I sat down on a large rock to eat lunch. That's when I noticed footprints. Not mine. These were bigger, wider stride, deeper heel imprints. I couldn't tell how fresh they were, but they were heading the same direction as me. That wasn't too unusual. It was a trail after all. But I'd chosen this trail specifically because it wasn't popular. I hadn't seen another car at the lot or another person since I started. I didn't like the idea of someone else out here without me knowing about it. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe someone had come through earlier in the week. Maybe they were hunting. Either way, I kept going. But now I was more alert. I found myself checking behind me every hour or so, glancing off the trail into the woods, looking for movement I couldn't explain. That night, I camped near a small creek. It was a beautiful spot. Trees rising on both sides, the soft trickle of water nearby. I set up camp, ate, and built a small fire. The temperature dropped quick after sunset, and I turned in early. That night, I woke up again. But this time, I heard something. It was faint just beyond the nylon of the tent, soft crunching. Someone walking. It wasn't constant. A few steps, then stillness. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, heart hammering. I reached slowly for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. My breath was loud, felt like it echoed. The steps circled the tent once, then stopped. I could hear nothing but the creak again. I waited, 10 minutes, 15. Eventually, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent and poke my head out. There was nothing, no one, just trees and darkness. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up in my tent until the sky started to lighten. By morning, I felt drained. I packed up quick and got moving. I decided to cut the trip short and head back. I figured if someone was messing around out here, I didn't want to run into them again. I could always come back another time with someone else. About 2 miles into my return hike, I found something that made my stomach turn. Hanging from a low branch just off the trail was a bundle of twine. And hanging from that twine were several small items. A lighter, an old bottle cap, a dirty playing card, and a plastic action figure, all strung together. It wasn't trash. It had been tied with care, like someone had placed it there for a reason. I stopped and stared at it for a long time. My mind raced. It didn't feel like something a kid left. It didn't feel like a joke either. It felt intentional, like a message. I kept moving, picking up my pace. I checked behind me more often now. I didn't stop for lunch. I didn't stop to rest. I just walked. By late afternoon, I was about 2 miles from the trailhead when I saw the footprints again. This time they were fresh. The heel edges were still crisp, not worn down by wind or rain. And they were behind me, like someone had been following. I broke into a jog for the last stretch. My pack bounced awkwardly on my back, and my knees ached, but I didn't stop. I reached the gravel lot and nearly cried when I saw my car still sitting there, undisturbed. I unlocked the door, threw my pack in, and got inside. I didn't even take off my boots. I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, shaking, heart still racing. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors. Every time a car came up behind me, I felt my spine go stiff until it passed. When I got home, my husband wasn't there yet, which gave me time to settle in. I took a long shower, trying to wash off the feeling of being watched. I didn't even unpack my bag. That night, I tried to sleep. I felt safe at home, locked inside our apartment. The curtains drawn, the door bolted. But just like out in the woods, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was around 3 a.m. I sat up in bed, heart pounding again, and looked around. Nothing seemed off. I was about to lay back down when I noticed my phone light up on the nightstand. A notification, a text. There was no name, just a number I didn't recognize. The message said only, "Nice tent." I stared at it for a long time, my blood turning cold. I showed it to my husband when he got up a few hours later. We called the police. They asked if I had seen anyone. I said no, just footsteps and that weird hanging thing. I showed them the message. They asked if I still had the number. I did. They traced it, but it was a burner. No way to track it further. That morning, I walked around our apartment and checked every window, every lock. Everything seemed fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had followed me back. That somehow they knew where I lived. Couldn't prove it. I never saw anyone, but I started seeing shadows on the edge of my vision. Movement outside our windows late at night. A couple times I thought I heard footsteps outside the door, but when I looked, no one was there. My husband thought I was just shaken up from the trip. I wanted to believe that too. But one night, about a week later, he shook me awake and told me I'd been talking in my sleep. I asked what I said. He told me I said, "Don't look, he's watching." After that, we moved. We broke our lease, packed up, and got the hell out of that apartment. I changed my phone number, got a new email, everything. I stopped hiking alone. I still hike, but only with others. I never go off the beaten path anymore. It's been almost a year now. I haven't gotten any more messages. I haven't seen any more shadows or heard footsteps. Life feels normal again, mostly, but sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I remember how real that fear felt. The kind that burrows in and stays. The kind that doesn't need a monster or a ghost. Just a person. A stranger with no reason, no face, no voice. Just footsteps in the night, and a message I'll never forget. Nice tent. It had been nearly 3 months since I broke things off with Nate. We were together for a little over a year, and it wasn't bad in the beginning. He was charming, funny in his own awkward way, and always seemed eager to help with things. He made dinner sometimes, walked my dog when I worked late, and even bought me hiking gear for my birthday last year. I wasn't used to someone taking such a keen interest in me. Felt nice at first, but slowly that helpfulness became something else. It started with questions about where I was going and who I was with, then turned into guilt tripping whenever I made plans without him. He started getting angry about things that didn't make sense. One time, I posted a photo on a solo hike. Nothing big, just a trail near the lake, and he flipped out over text, accusing me of trying to make it look like I was single. I brushed it off for a while. Everyone gets a little insecure sometimes, right? Still, the little things kept piling up. He'd show up uninvited, pretending to just be in the area. He started going through my things, at first subtle, then not so much. One night, I caught him scrolling through my messages while I was in the shower. He didn't even try to hide it. That was the moment I knew it had to end. I told him I needed space and asked him to leave my apartment. It didn't go smoothly. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, but not before saying something I didn't expect. "You'll change your mind." "I know you will." I tried to shake it off, but something about the way he said it stuck with me. There wasn't rage in his voice. It was something else, like certainty. Like he already had a plan in place and my decisions didn't matter. In the weeks after that, I blocked his number and his socials. I changed my routines, started parking a block away from my place. I even asked a coworker to walk me to my car after our late shifts. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched sometimes. I'd come home and something would feel off, like a kitchen drawer not quite closed the way I left it, or the faint smell of his cologne lingering when it shouldn't. My friends told me to call the police, but what was I going to say? That I felt like someone had been in my apartment? There was never any solid proof, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. A month went by, and things felt like they were slowly settling. I hadn't seen or heard from him. I even let myself go hiking again, which I'd stopped doing for a while. Being in the woods always cleared my head, gave me a sense of control I didn't have in other parts of my life. I'd grown up hiking with my dad, and I always felt safer in nature than I did in a busy city. I knew the signs to watch for: weather shifts, animals, trail markers. Nature didn't lie to you, people did. There's a trail about 2 hours north of where I live. Nothing too remote, but far enough that it doesn't get a lot of foot traffic during the weekdays. It follows a narrow ridge for a few miles, then dips into a basin with a creek and some smaller waterfalls. I'd done it once before with friends, but this time I decided to go solo. I checked the forecast: clear skies, low wind, no rain. I packed my usual gear: water bladder, granola bars, knife, flashlight, small first aid kit, and my GPS. I always kept my phone fully charged and brought a battery pack. I wasn't reckless. I didn't tell anyone I was going, not because I was hiding it, but because it was a last-minute decision. I just wanted a day away. I left early in the morning, made it to the trailhead by 9 a.m., and parked in the small dirt lot at the entrance. There were 2 other cars there, which made me feel better. I took a picture of my license plate and texted it to myself, something I started doing after reading about it online, just in case. The first couple miles were uneventful. Cool air, bird song, the occasional squirrel darting across the path. The ridge gave me some beautiful views of the valley below, and I stopped for a quick snack before heading down into the basin. It got quieter there. The trees were thicker, blocking out most of the light, and the air smelled damp, earthy. I liked it. It reminded me of camping trips when I was younger, when I'd sit by the creek and listen to water trickling over rocks. I passed a few landmarks I remembered: a crooked birch tree with a hollow trunk, a moss-covered boulder with a faded trail marker. I knew the loop would bring me back around to the ridge, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. But around mile 6, I started to notice something odd. First was the cigarette butt. It was still warm when I found it, half buried in the dirt near the side of the trail. I crouched down and stared at it. No one else had passed me going the other direction. I'd been hiking for almost 4 hours, and the cars in the lot didn't suggest heavy traffic. Whoever dropped it had to be nearby. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had doubled back or taken a side path I hadn't noticed. Still, I felt my stomach knot up. A little further on, I saw the boot prints. They weren't mine. Mine had a deep tread, and these were smoother, maybe a different kind of hiking shoe. But they were over mine. That's what made my throat tighten. Someone had been behind me, following my path. I turned around slowly, scanning the trail behind me, but there was no one, just trees and the whisper of wind. I picked up my pace. Not a run, not yet, but enough to get my heart going. I told myself again it was probably another hiker. Maybe someone who'd taken a break earlier and was now catching up. But something about it didn't sit right. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear anything but my own breath and the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried not to think about the cigarette again, but my brain kept circling back to it. I came to the creek around midday. It was the halfway point of the loop. I crouched near the water, filled my bottle using the filter I always brought, and kept looking over my shoulder. Still nothing. I stood and turned to get back on the trail when I saw it. Something small and dark wedged between 2 rocks on the creek bank. I picked it up slowly. A black key, my old spare key. I hadn't seen it since I gave it to Nate 6 months ago. I stared at it for a long time, my hand trembling. There was no doubt. It had the same little chip in the corner from when I dropped it in the parking lot at work. I didn't carry it anymore. I had changed the locks a few weeks after the breakup, just in case. But seeing it here, out in the middle of nowhere, made my skin go cold. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that I dropped it here months ago and just forgot. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd never taken Nate on this trail. I'd never even mentioned it to him. That's when I heard the snap. Not loud, but close. A branch maybe 10 feet behind me. I didn't turn around. I just started walking. Fast, controlled, no looking back. The trail was narrow, and the trees pressed in on both sides. I kept my hand on the handle of the knife clipped to my belt. My legs moved automatically, every step heavier than the last. I didn't know what I'd do if someone actually came at me. I wasn't a fighter. I was a runner. I reached the fork where the trail looped back to the ridge. I knew the climb would be brutal. Steep switchbacks, loose dirt, but it was more open, less cover. I pushed myself hard, breathing like I'd just run a mile, my calves burning. I kept going, half jogging up the slope, not caring how loud I was. When I reached the top, I stopped to catch my breath. I turned to look down the path. Nothing, no one, but I didn't feel safe. I felt watched. I kept moving, faster than before, glancing behind me every few minutes. The forest felt different now. Not peaceful, not quiet, just hollow, like something was waiting for me to let my guard down. It wasn't until I got back to the trailhead that I let myself breathe. My car was still there. The other 2 were gone. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment with my head against the steering wheel. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and I could barely feel my fingers. When I got home, I checked every window, every door. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't stop thinking about that key. I held it under the kitchen light and turned it over in my hand. It was definitely mine, which meant Nate had been on that trail. Recently, I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with my knife on the nightstand, the lights on. In the morning, I went to the hardware store and bought a new deadbolt and a door camera. I also took every single thing Nate had ever left in my apartment. An old hoodie, a charger, a pair of socks, and I put them in a cardboard box. I left it outside the building next to the dumpsters. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want him near me. The next day, the box was gone. I don't know if he took it. I'll never know. But I haven't seen him since. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear someone at the door. Sometimes I dream about the sound of branches snapping behind me. But I don't hike alone anymore. I don't post where I'm going. I don't trust quiet trails, no matter how beautiful they look. People talk about the danger of wild animals in the woods. But the scariest thing I've ever faced out there wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was someone who used to love me, and who thought that meant he owned me. It was 2003, and I was on a hiking trip in one of the most remote and beautiful places I'd ever visited. The Hoh Rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. I had been dreaming of doing this hike for months. The idea of starting from the Pacific Ocean and working my way up to Mount Olympus was thrilling. It felt like an adventure that could only happen in a place like this. Dense, misty forest and the kind of solitude you can only get by being miles away from civilization. The first day of the hike was incredible. The ocean breeze, the salty smell of the sea, the sense of starting something big and new. It all felt perfect. My gear was solid, the trail was well marked, and I was moving at a steady pace. By the time I set up camp that evening, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the moss-covered forest floor. I was exhausted, but in a good way. There was a calm satisfaction in having accomplished what I'd set out to do that day. But day 2, that was when things started to get weird. The fog rolled in thick and fast, like it was some kind of natural force determined to erase the world around me. I couldn't see more than 5 feet in front of me, which made navigation incredibly tricky. I had a GPS, but it was useless. The fog was so dense, the signal couldn't penetrate, and I had to rely on my sense of direction and the sound of the Hoh River, which I knew would lead me to one of the campsites I was aiming for. With each step, the fog pressed in tighter. It felt like I was walking through a dream. Everything was muted, still, and soft. The trees were ghostly figures looming in the haze, and the ground beneath my feet was slick with dew. I could hear the river, its sound muffled by the fog, but I couldn't see anything beyond the blur of trees around me. As the hours passed, I began to feel a strange unease settling in my chest. The fog didn't lift, and time seemed to slow down. I was moving blindly now, hoping to reach the campsite before nightfall. But it wasn't night that worried me. It was the sensation that I wasn't alone, that perhaps something or someone was out there, just beyond my reach in the fog. I chalked it up to fatigue, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a small clearing, a flat patch of earth surrounded by tall, gnarled trees. It seemed like a good spot to set up camp, so I pitched my tent, and as I did, I couldn't help but notice that the air felt heavier, as if it was pressing down on me. The fog wasn't going anywhere. It had swallowed everything, and the world outside my small campsite had turned into a void. I crawled into my tent, grabbed a power bar from my bag, and ate while sitting cross-legged on the ground. I could hear nothing but the quiet rustle of the trees and the occasional distant sound of the river. There was an odd stillness to the place, the kind of silence that made you acutely aware of every little noise, each shift of the wind, each crack of a twig. As the sun set, the fog thickened. Darkness came fast, like the whole forest had just shut down for the night. The kind of blackness that's so deep, it feels unnatural. I turned on my headlamp and checked my gear once more, but soon enough, I crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to quiet the growing sense of anxiety that was gnawing at me. I couldn't place it, but the silence was unnerving. It wasn't like the stillness of a normal night in the woods. There was something else, something suffocating about it. I lay there for a while, trying to focus on the sound of my own breathing, the soft hum of the world outside. The air inside the tent felt warm and stale. My mind wandered, replaying the hike, the sense of isolation, the fog that made me feel like I was drifting through a place out of time. That's when I heard it, a low, rhythmic huffing sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again. Huff, huff, deep and labored, like someone or something was trying to catch its breath. The noise seemed to come from somewhere close, maybe 5 feet away from my tent. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. What the hell was that? It wasn't the wind. No, this was deliberate. There was something else out there, something big. Maybe it was an animal, maybe something I couldn't even identify. I had no idea, but my anxiety was shooting through the roof. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I lay there, completely still, listening to the sound. The huffing came again, closer this time, and I could hear the distinct rustle of the forest floor, something moving in the brush. Panic started to creep in. Maybe it was a bear or a cougar. Whatever it wasn't making any attempt to be quiet. The sound of its breathing was unmistakable. I reached for my flashlight, trying to move as quietly as possible. My fingers fumbled around the gear in the dark, trying to grab it without alerting whatever was out there. My breath was shallow as I pulled the drawstring of my tent open just enough to poke my head out. The fog was thick, and I could see nothing beyond the faint glow of my flashlight. Then, through the mist, I saw it. A massive, dark shape looming just 5 feet away from my tent. I froze, my blood running cold. It was big, taller than I was, maybe, and its form was vague and shadowed in the fog, but there was no mistaking what I was looking at. It was a Roosevelt elk, and it was standing right outside my tent, its breath heavy and erratic. I've hiked in these woods for years, and I know elk can be huge, but this one was massive. Its dark fur blended with the shadows of the night, and its antlers were barely visible in the fog, towering above it. I had no idea how it had gotten so close without me hearing it before, but there it was, just standing there, breathing heavily, probably as confused as I was. I instinctively turned the flashlight on and aimed it at the elk. The beam hit its eyes, and in that moment, everything seemed to happen at once. The elk bolted in panic, its hooves pounding the earth as it raced away. In its haste, it slammed into a nearby tree with a sickening thud, knocking itself out cold. I sat there in my tent, wide-eyed and breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. The huffing noise had stopped, replaced by the sound of the elk's hooves and then the dull thud of its impact with the tree. I lay in the darkness, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind kept replaying the image of the elk, its massive body stumbling in the fog, its heavy breath the only sound in the entire world. Minutes passed, and the forest fell back into a deathly silence. I could still hear the elk groaning softly, and eventually, it managed to get up, grunting as it moved off into the trees. My body remained tense, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, but nothing came. I stayed in the tent for a while, unable to sleep. I kept hearing the elk's grunt, but it was getting farther away. Finally, I mustered the courage to poke my head out again. The fog had started to lift just enough that I could see a few feet in front of me. The elk was gone. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to every noise in the forest, wondering what else was out there in the fog, just beyond my reach. When morning came, the fog had finally begun to clear, and the world outside was bathed in the soft light of dawn. I got out of the tent and packed up my things, still on edge but thankful that I hadn't been injured by the huge animal. It wasn't until later, when I finally made it to the next campsite, that I felt the full weight of the night's events. I'd had an encounter with a massive elk, yes, but there was something deeper, something about that night in the fog that stayed with me long after I left the rainforest. It was a reminder that, out there in the wild, things can change in an instant, and you never really know what might be lurking just beyond the fog. It was a cool afternoon when I decided to go hiking in the Green Mountains of Vermont. The kind of day that seemed perfect for being outside, with crisp air and clear skies. I'd been hiking in these parts before, but there was something about today that felt different. The trail was quiet, only the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot and the distant call of a bird breaking the silence. The air smelled like earth and pine, the scent of a forest that had been undisturbed for years. Felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I'd been out on the trail for a couple of hours, following the familiar path through the woods, lost in thought, when something caught my eye. It wasn't the usual mess of branches or a patch of sunlight breaking through the canopy. It was a bright red shirt, hanging off a low branch of a tree just a few feet off the trail. The color was so striking against the dull brown and green of the forest that it almost seemed out of place. My first instinct was that someone had left it behind, maybe a hiker who had lost it in the brush, or perhaps it was a piece of litter. But then I noticed something odd. The shirt was hanging in a way that looked intentional. It wasn't just abandoned or carelessly tossed over a branch. It was draped there, almost neatly, as though someone had placed it with purpose. I don't know why, but something about that shirt unsettled me. I should have just kept walking, kept to the trail, and ignored it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check it out. Maybe it was a marker or some strange sign left by another hiker, or maybe there was something more to it. I veered off the main trail and stepped through the underbrush toward the tree. As I got closer, I noticed something else that made my skin prickle. There was a faint smell in the air, a damp, earthy odor mixed with something more pungent, almost rotting. My stomach turned a little, but I kept going, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. When I got directly underneath the shirt, I saw something that immediately stopped me in my tracks. There were 2 freshly dug graves, the dirt piled up in uneven mounds next to each one. The graves themselves were shallow, nothing more than a few feet deep. The earth around them was soft and loose, as though they hadn't been there long. I couldn't help but stare at them, my mind racing. Why were there graves out here in the middle of nowhere? There was no cemetery for miles, no nearby town, just endless woods. It didn't make sense. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat, as I noticed a few weathered headstones scattered around the area. At first glance, they looked like they belonged to an old graveyard, maybe one forgotten or abandoned long ago. But as I examined them more closely, my heart began to race. The headstones weren't ancient at all. In fact, they looked like they had been moved recently. The inscriptions were faded, but still readable: names, dates, all the things you'd expect on a grave marker. Yet something was off. The stones weren't settled properly. They weren't in the ground the way a typical grave marker would be. They were crooked, leaning at odd angles, as if someone had dragged them here and shoved them into the earth without much care. The more I looked around, the more uneasy I became. It didn't feel like a place where the dead had peacefully rested. There was something wrong about it. Something made it feel less like a graveyard and more like a place where the dead were being used. Stolen. The thought hit me like a brick. Could someone have stolen these headstones? And if so, why? The graves, if that's even what they were, looked too fresh to be a natural part of the woods. My instincts screamed at me to leave. Everything about this felt wrong. The shirt hanging from the tree, the disturbed earth, the odd arrangement of the headstones. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of it all, when I noticed something else in the dirt. A scrap of paper, wedged between 2 rocks. I bent down to pick it up, holding my breath. It was old, yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible. It looked like an address, maybe a name, scribbled hastily in a way that made it clear it wasn't meant to be found. I shoved it into my pocket without thinking, deciding that whatever it was, I wasn't about to stick around to find out more. My heart was racing now, my body on edge. I had to leave. The thought of the graves, of what might be happening out here, was too much to handle. I turned quickly and retraced my steps, heading back to the trail, all the while looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally made it back to the main trail, I broke into a jog, not stopping until I reached the parking lot at the trailhead. My mind was still racing with questions, but one thing was clear: I needed to report this. The whole thing felt like some twisted secret hidden in the woods, and I wasn't about to ignore it. The next morning, I contacted the local sheriff's office. I wasn't sure what exactly I was going to tell them, but I described what I had seen as best as I could. They seemed interested, but not overly alarmed at first. Graveyards and abandoned sites in the woods weren't exactly uncommon in Vermont. But when I mentioned the freshly dug graves, the disturbed earth, and the headstones that looked like they'd been moved, the tone shifted. They took the report seriously and sent out a team to investigate. I wasn't sure what they would find, but the possibility of grave robbing, that was something I couldn't ignore. A few days later, I received a call from the sheriff's office. They'd investigated the site, and it turned out I had stumbled upon something much more disturbing than I could have imagined. It wasn't just an abandoned graveyard. Someone had been stealing headstones from a local cemetery and relocating them into the woods. It appeared that they were trying to hide the evidence of their theft by digging up the graves and moving the markers. I still couldn't believe it. How could someone steal headstones? But the worst part? The bodies were gone too. The graves weren't just emptied of their markers. They were empty of their contents as well. The authorities were able to confirm that the stolen headstones had come from a nearby cemetery, one that had been around for centuries. But there was no sign of the bodies that should have been buried there. They couldn't find any solid leads as to who was behind the thefts, but the investigation was still ongoing. I was told that I might be called back for more information, but I never heard from them again. What bothered me the most, though, was the unanswered question. Why? Why take the headstones, and why take the bodies too? What was the person or persons doing with them? I'll never know. The woods in Vermont were quiet again, and the strange, unsettling feeling I had when I first saw that shirt hanging in the tree lingered in my mind for weeks. Every time I hike through the Green Mountains, I wonder if I'll stumble upon something like that again, and I can't shake the thought that whatever I uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. Whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to hide their crime, and there was no telling what they'd do next. As for the red shirt, I never found out who it belonged to. Maybe it was just some strange coincidence. Maybe it was meant as a marker or sign for whoever had been doing the work in the woods. But I can't help but feel like it was a warning, a clue I was never supposed to find. The whole experience still makes my skin crawl. Sometimes when I walk past old graveyards or see a headstone on the side of the road, I wonder how many others there are, hidden in the woods, forgotten, and whether the people who put them there are still out there, waiting for the next person to stumble upon their secret. The Sierra Mountains were as beautiful as they were unpredictable. I had always wanted to backpack through them, and finally, I had the chance. My buddy Matt and I had been planning this trip for months, saving up the gear, looking at maps, and researching every aspect of the trail. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Just two guys, the wilderness, and nothing but the sound of our boots crunching the dirt beneath us. The plan was simple enough. We'd start at one end of the Sierra and make our way to the other over 5 days, camping along the way. We had done some serious hiking before, but this would be different. We were going deep into the backcountry, and that meant taking care of a few key things that most people forget. One of the most important tasks on any backpacking trip was securing your food at night. Specifically, making sure that bears didn't get to it. We were well aware of the rules. Bears are smart. They're opportunistic feeders, and they've been known to tear apart tents, backpacks, and anything else that might hold something edible. The solution is simple: the bear bag. You hang your food and anything that smells like food, like toothpaste, deodorant, and even some types of soap, high up in a tree, away from your campsite. Keeps the bears from getting any ideas. Or at least that's the theory. We made camp at a small spot near a creek on the second night. The sky was clear, and the air smelled like pine and fresh mountain soil. We were far enough from civilization that there were no other hikers around, and the only sounds were the rush of the creek and the occasional chirp of a cricket. After a long day of hiking, we were tired but happy. Matt and I were in our element, cooking a simple dinner over the camp stove, cracking open some cold beers, and laughing about old stories from high school. There was a certain kind of peace in the wilderness. It was the kind of peace that made you forget about everything else. We had set up camp, cooked our food, and eaten, and now it was time to do the bear bag routine. It was something we were all familiar with, Matt, Jake, and I. We had done it on every trip before, and we had done it in a way that felt like second nature. The procedure was simple. Place everything that had a scent, even things like chapstick and sunscreen, into a bag, then hoist it up into a tree. You want the bag at least 10 feet off the ground and 4 feet from the tree trunk to keep it out of a bear's reach. We double-checked everything, making sure that the food and scented items were securely hung. Then, as usual, we relaxed around the fire. But there was one critical mistake. Matt had forgotten to put his toothpaste in the bear bag. It was an innocent oversight. We were all tired, and it wasn't the first time any of us had made a mistake. But on this trip, it was a mistake that would change everything. It wasn't until later that night, around 2 a.m., that we realized the gravity of it. I was in my tent, just starting to fall into a deep sleep. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was soothing, and my body was exhausted from the day's hike. But suddenly, I woke up with a start. The noise wasn't right. It was a low, guttural sound, like something large was moving around our campsite. The first thing I thought was that it was the wind, maybe the branches swaying in the trees, but then the sound came again. This time it was closer. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then we heard it. Matt's voice, sharp and panicked. He was yelling, not loud, but enough to pierce the stillness of the night. "Guys, get up. There's a bear." I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Bears are a serious threat, especially in the middle of the night when they're more likely to be rummaging for food. But this wasn't just a bear passing by. No, it sounded like it was right on top of Matt. I scrambled out of my tent, my head spinning. In the faint moonlight, I could see the silhouette of the bear, its massive form looming over Matt's tent. The bear's head was shoved through the opening in the tent, snuffling around. It was clawing at the fabric, clearly attracted to the scent of whatever it had found, Matt's toothpaste. Matt was yelling again, trying to push the bear away, but the bear wasn't backing off. It was so close now that I could hear its breath, heavy and labored. My stomach churned. I could see Matt's legs thrashing inside the tent, but the bear wasn't letting up. The animal's claws were tearing at the fabric, and it seemed to be completely focused on the toothpaste. "Get it off him," Jake shouted, his voice full of fear and adrenaline. I didn't even think. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, an old frying pan that we had used to cook dinner earlier. I ran towards Matt's tent, banging the pan with all my might, hoping to make enough noise to scare the bear away. The bear barely flinched. I took another swing at the pan, trying to make as much noise as possible, and Jake started throwing rocks from a pile near the creek. We were trying everything, shouting, banging metal, throwing things, anything to distract the bear long enough for Matt to get free. The bear was relentless, but after what felt like an eternity of chaos, the bear finally lifted its head. For a split second, the bear seemed to hesitate, looking around at us. Then it backed off, retreating slowly into the darkness of the trees. Matt was still screaming, but now he was scrambling out of the tent, eyes wide and panicked. He didn't care about the ripped fabric or the bear's proximity. He just wanted out. I reached out and pulled him away from the wreckage of his tent, and we all backed up, hearts racing. The bear, satisfied with whatever scent had drawn it in, didn't pursue us. It faded into the shadows of the forest, leaving us in a stunned silence. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, and my whole body was shaking. We all stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline still flooding our systems. The campsite was a mess. Matt's tent was shredded, the toothpaste gone, and the air smelled faintly of wet fur and pine. But we were alive. The bear hadn't attacked. It had been after food. It had been after something so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Matt's toothpaste. Yet it had nearly ended in disaster. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. There was no way we could after that. We huddled around the fire, keeping an eye on the shadows, our minds still reeling. We talked about what had happened, but no one said much. There was nothing to say. We all knew that we had gotten lucky. Bears don't often attack humans, but they will if they're desperate enough. And that night, we had been too careless. The next morning, we packed up early. Matt's tent was beyond repair, and we didn't want to risk staying any longer. The rest of the trip was quiet, uneventful even. We kept our distance from the bear bag and made sure every scented item, no matter how small, was hung up securely in the tree. The rest of the hike,